People of Yarmouth County video series, made possible through the Department of Communities, Culture and Heritage Forward Fund, focuses on our region of Yarmouth County and some of the communities and cultural identities that encompass it. We wanted to showcase one of the most important part of our community, our people. The stories told in our 6-part video series are excerpts from longer interviews conducted by the Yarmouth County Museum and Archives staff. They are short stories of both the past and the present. They are memories told by the people of Yarmouth County. Some stories are funny, some are sad, and some will make you think. On behalf of the Yarmouth County Museum and Archives, we'd like to say a very special thank you to all the participants who took part in this project. We loved hearing your stories.
I'm Oral Mooney. I was Treen. I grew up in Amherst, but I came here when I was 17 to go in nurses training. Well, Mooney's is quite a prominent name in Yarmouth. My husband's father had a drugstore, Mooney's Drugstore, and then when his older brother graduated from Dalhousie, he started City Drugstore in Yarmouth. And after we were married, my husband had taken his pharmacy also, and he went in business with his dad, and he encouraged me to take my pharmacy, which I did. And they had the Mooney's Drugstore on Main Street for years, and then Shoppers was going to open in Yarmouth, and my husband was asked by, there were 2 men in Toronto that owned Shoppers to start with, and my husband was very familiar with them because he was president of the Canadian Pharmaceutical Association. And so he opened up Shoppers, and I only worked part-time because I had 7 children, and he died when he was 54, and Shoppers asked me if I would take over, so I was manager at the at Shoppers Drug Mart for 15 years until I was 65. Well, I enjoyed my nurse's training. I had a little bit of a problem when I first went on the floors because I had taken in when I was 17. I finished school when I was 17, and I applied. And when I was assigned to the men's ward, and I'd go around, we had to take their temperatures and blood pressure and everything. And they look at me and they say, "You can't look after me, you're too young." They thought I was much too young. Anyway, when I got in the drugstore business, I enjoyed seeing the people coming in, and we were one of the first drugstores, in fact we were the first drugstore that had a separate room for counseling and that type of thing. And that was on Main Street, before we even went to Shoppers. And we would, at that time, people were just handed their prescription with the directions on the bottle, and they weren't told anything about their drugs or anything. Of course, there was no Google or anything, so they didn't know how to find out about what they were taking, if they cared. You know, most of them just took them. So then when we went with Shoppers, we had the same thing, separate place. And when I would work at night, and the doctors would call, they had a sick child in the outpatients, and we closed at 10 o'clock. And they'd say, you know, this was like 9:45, and they'd say, "Would you stay open so your prescription could get filled?" And I'd always say, "Yes, sure, no problem." Well, the fishermen got to know that we would do this, and they go out like 4 o'clock in the morning and they forget their inhalers or something. So we'd get these phone calls, you know, "This is so-and-so, and we forgot our inhaler and we're down at the wharf, you know, can we get our inhaler?" And we looked after them for them. Well, I met my husband. And he was definitely staying in Yarmouth, and I've always liked Yarmouth. It's an historical town. My people are Empire Loyalists that settled up in the Amherst area and in Malagash, to be exact. And they were in the boat building business, and there was lots of history here in the boat building business and that type of thing. And I like Yarmouth. Yarmouth has certainly changed a lot. It's not the big business area that it was 150 years ago. And it's steadily changed since I've been here. Like, there's a different atmosphere. There's more people coming and going. 150 years ago, people that lived in Amherst didn't travel to Yarmouth. Well, when we first started going back and forth, it took 10 hours to drive to Yarmouth, to Amherst from Yarmouth. 10 hours. Most of the roads were gravel. So it has changed a great deal, and yet it hasn't. I think Yarmouth's on the upswing, really. We've had a thing to know Yarmouth more, and I think even the people in Nova Scotia realize that Yarmouth is not as far away as they think it is. A lot of people think that, you know, Yarmouth is too far away. We can't go there. But we always are going there, you know, all over Nova Scotia, and we don't think twice about it. But I think Nova Scotians themselves are getting to know that there is a place that's called Yarmouth, and it's worth visiting. So I think we're on the upswing.
Hello, well, my name is Hubert Hall, and I was born in Beaver River on the Digby County side of Beaver River. I was captain on the Blue Nose for the last 20 years that I worked. Before that, I had worked on other ships for Marine Atlantic, including 5 years on the Prince Edward Island service from Borden to Cape Tormentine. I was second and first mate up there. And working there, we lived in Cape Tormentine. And it's really interesting to see how Cape Tormentine has practically disappeared from the map since the bridge was opened in 1997. It's just absolutely nothing there anymore. There is a fishing wharf with a few fishing boats, and other than that, it would be a ghost village. Oh, it's family roots, really. Yeah. When I was away on ships before Marine Atlantic, I was away out, you know, we were sailing all over the place, and I was away out of the country. So when the Blue Nose, in 1959, I applied for a job on the Blue Nose to come back home, in which I got a job on it. But then there was a better job with Marine Atlantic on the PEI ferries, so we moved to Cape Tormentine and worked on those ferries for 5 years until I came back and got a permanent job on the Blue Nose. So that's why I came to Yarmouth, is to be with family, with my wife's family in mind. Mm-hmm.
The reason I ended up in Yarmouth was I married a maritimer. And so my husband was the grandson of R.H. Davis, and R.H. Davis is a very old business that's run here since 1897, which we sold 2 years ago. The name still exists, but the business no longer exists here. So the reason I moved here was because he wanted to go back and run the family business that his grandfather had begun. So the business was begun in 1897 by Ralph Harold Davis, and he would be the son of Captain Samuel Davis, and I believe here in the museum you will have a watch that was given to Captain Samuel Davis because he had rescued a ship in distress. In 1996 we purchased the Bonda business, which is another part of Yarmouth history, which is a Dutch company. They came here in the 50s, an industrialist, Mr. Bonda, and they had farms fishing businesses, and eventually the building that everyone knows here on Parade Street was a knitting mill. They employed over 100 people. Many people worked in that business. Many women, many Acadian women worked there. And when we closed the business, sold it a few years ago, and the warehouse, of course, is still here. It was sold to someone in PEI, so the inventory went to PEI, but the warehouse stayed here. People came in to see the building and said, you know, my aunt worked there, or my grandmother, or my mother had worked in the business. It was a very significant business, the bond business. And we bought it because they manufactured Nova Scotia tartan kilts and other wearables. And for us, that was like another souvenir, so it was just part of the souvenir business. And actually, it isn't the vibrant, it's a town, like all small towns that have had a lot of ups and downs. It's hard for people to believe how amazingly vital these towns were during the sailing ship days. And all, you know, how the people traveled all over the world. And I know my husband talks about the Boston boat, which went from Boston to Yarmouth. You know, we tend to think of people at that time, not that they didn't travel as much, but in actual fact they did, and they knew quite a lot about the world, and they just traveled in a, you know, in a different manner. From the time I moved here in 1985, when we moved here, I would say I always said, may I never live in Yarmouth. So the main street was just enjoying a revival, really. It was the time that the government had put money into Main Street programs. So when we moved here in July of 1985, I think in October, when I began doing more work in the store, the whole street was torn up, the sidewalks were, and we had little, you know, wooden platforms that we used. So that was the beginning of putting in the new sidewalks. It was a while after the malls had opened, and like for all small towns, a mall was the killer of the downtown. It was the beginning of what was called the Yarmouth Development Corporation. That was a group of merchants who got together and said, look, if we don't do something, you know, we're going to lose all our business to the malls. And that was the beginning of parking lots in the downtown, like the Collins Street parking lot that they're discussing now and perhaps going to use part of for their art center. Because at the mall, of course, you could go and park. And in downtowns, people were used to walking. So there was a big change at that time and a big revitalization of the main street. And in that 30 years after that, there was, I would say, a slow decline. The tourism industry definitely declined quite a bit. The fishing industry is not as vibrant, perhaps, as it was. And today we've just seen another revamp of the downtown where they're fixing up the buildings and trying to revitalize it. And we see people moving here from other parts of Canada for totally different reasons than I think they moved here for once. They maybe moved here to work in the cotton mill once, or you know, some other industry. It's certainly during the days when the tin mine was here, which was short. People came for that reason. But now people come often sort of retired or early retirement because it's quiet, the climate is good, which not everyone maybe really appreciates, and it's safe. And it's you know, a nice place to, you can volunteer, you can be as busy as you want to. And I'm always amazed when I meet people who have no connection to the area at all, who've moved here and absolutely love it. And I think people who come from away often appreciate the area better than the people who have grown up and lived here. They don't, you know, they see it with different eyes. So that's something I've thought about, because I thought there's all this celebration about Canada's 150th. And I'm not exactly a flag waver, although I'm very much a lover of Canada. And I thought back because we're going to Montreal. We go every summer for a family reunion. And I was listening to CBC, and they were talking about some of the exhibitions that are going to be on because of 1967. because it's 50 years since that one. And I lived in Montreal at that time, and that, you know, the Expo 67 was a huge deal for Canada. And people came from all over the world to see it. It was a magnificent exhibition, one of the better ones that have ever been held, I gather. It certainly was very hard on the finances of the province of Quebec. I think at that time, it sort of, it engendered a big feeling of, within Canadians, that Canada was an important country. And I read recently that this whole thing of Canada Day, prior to that, we often celebrated May the 24th, which was the Queen's birthday, Victoria Day. And I grew up in the province of Quebec where we had Saint Jean-Baptiste Day, so the big day there for especially anyone of French culture was in June. So I realized I was less of a July 1st person than other people might be. And I began, and that's why I was thinking back to 67. So 67 was, I would have been probably a much bigger flag waver then than I was now, which is interesting. But it was a time when the rise of separatism in Quebec, which was a very interesting time. And it was an interesting time to live in the province of Quebec. I think that the province of Quebec is vital to what Canada is. And I think without it, we would be a very different country. And I understand that they feel it's one of the reasons that Canada accepts immigrants so easily, because we have been two cultures that learn to get along with each other, and because of the way things were set up during Confederation and Quebec kept certain rights to themselves, we have learned to accommodate each other, sometimes not as well as we should. But I have since, as one gets older, lives in different places and travels more, when you travel, I've been to countries like Asia and South America, beautiful countries, and China is fantastic in what they're doing. But you come to appreciate how wonderful Canada is. It's amazing, and it's a beautiful country, but there are a lot of beautiful countries in the world that you can live in. But the freedom that one has in Canada, how we would be traveling somewhere and you'd sort of look at each other and you'd come back to, sometimes it was on a cruise ship, and you get together and you say, boy, are we lucky we were born in Canada. Just the luck of the draw.
I'm Vera Solos, and I've lived in Yarmouth most of my life. So that's been 90 years. Okay, it were my mom and dad. My dad was a watchmaker and jeweler, and we lived on Porter Street, and Mom stayed home because in those days that's what you did. And my brother was born when I was about 5 years old. And there were a lot of little kids around, so there was always something to do, mischief to get into, and games to play, and there weren't many cars, so you could play in the road. And there wasn't much pavement either. When I got through school, I worked in a bank. I was the manager's secretary. And I didn't like it much until I got a paycheck, and then I could see the meaning of it all. It was so great to have some money that you could, well, our parents used to kind of educate us on, mine did anyway, on if you had money, what you did with it. When you got your paycheck, you put 10% in the bank. That was the first thing you did, and you left it there forever. You couldn't have any fun with that. And you had to pay your parents for your food and your room, rental, sort of. So, and I do remember that for when I started working when I was 17, I think. Yeah, in the summer, the girls didn't work, they played all summer, so that was fun. We spent a lot of time at Lake Milo and a lot more time at the beach. We all got our bikes, I think, around the same time. There were quite a good crowd of us that chummed around together, and then we were off. And it was safe. You could go and spend all day. We'd take a bottle of pop and a sandwich and go find some water where we could swim and just play all day. It was wonderful, really. I never worked until I got a job after I got through school. And what else did we do? Yes, Lake Milo was great. Several of the girls' parents had canoes, so we'd go up and get the canoe in the water and spend all day on the lake. We must have really ruined our skin with the sun, because we were in it all the time, all summer. But none of the girls worked outside of, until they got through school. Most of them went to university. Some of them just got married from that. I shouldn't say just got married, but some of them got married, and some of them worked. There were quite a number of the girls that went into nursing. There was a good crowd of us, 14, maybe 15. 5 of us are still alive at this age. Well, we lived in New Brunswick for a while after we were first married, in the winter. My husband was a biologist, and he worked for the Atlantic Biological Station herring investigation. And he was at sea all summer, so I came home in the summertime until I got too many kids, and then we bought a house, and we pretty well stayed here all the time. We loved it here. We never wanted to move away. I think probably we would have been richer if we moved away in money, but we didn't really think about that. We just liked to live here. You name it, it's changed. Yes. I think there were a lot of family businesses in Yarmouth, and it was very prosperous at one time. And I think probably all small towns are similar, that the changes that happen are just, the whole world is changing. One thing, everybody got cars, okay? And when I first went out, I lived out of town, the road wasn't paved, so you were marooned in the winter, sometimes with snow, and in the January thaw with mud because the road wasn't paved. And then later in the spring breakup, you couldn't get off the road. You had to walk, and it's a mile to either end. And you call your taxi, because we didn't have a car for a long time, and meet them down at the end of the road. But that was only for a week or 10 days at a time, and then gradually the water would absorb into the earth and you could drive on the road again or walk. And what else has happened? Well, of course, the people that built our house, when they built it, there was no electricity even down there, but they installed a generator to make their own electricity. But by the time I got there to live, there was electricity. Television was just starting when I moved down in that house, so I was around for that, and transportation and communications are the big changes that I remember. And then of course you started getting the big stores that made a big change in Yarmouth, because there were corner stores. There are still some corner stores, but you just get in a hurry and you go to the nearest big store because you can get everything in the one place. I think that's probably any way you want to name it, it's pretty well changed. I can't think that, and the schools had changed a lot. They went from having a school for each village to, in Yarmouth County, there were 4 schools and the kids were bused. By the time my children started school, they took the bus to school. They didn't have to walk, which was a good thing, I thought. Oh yeah, I think we should celebrate big time all year. I'm very grateful that just by chance you could be born any place, couldn't you? Yeah, I've often thought how lucky we are that we wound up where we are. And if you get philosophical about it, it's hard to figure out how that ever happened with the whole world where you could have been born in, and to live in a place where you can be so content and proud of your country.
Yarmouth County Museum and Archives recognizes the support of the province of Nova Scotia. We are pleased to work in partnership with the Department of Communities, Culture and Heritage to develop and promote our cultural resources for all Nova Scotians.